All good things must come to an end. No civilization lasts forever. With the fall of Constantinople, we reach the end of the Middle Ages, as we reach the end of the course with this lecture. So let's look at what led up to the fall of Constantinople, the fall itself, and some of its results. Let's reach back to the first event we investigated, the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. We're going to go all the way back to the beginning as we start this, our last lecture. The decline and fall of the Roman government in the West affected Constantinople by weakening its defenses in that direction. Additionally, the West's fall meant less trade and prosperity. While the triple walls of Constantinople remained strong and the Eastern Empire still stretched down through the Levant into Egypt by the end of the 5th century, it experienced weakness on at least one front. That's the Western Front, because all of a sudden that was full of Visigoths who were unbounded. You can see too that the Persian Empire loomed to the east, and they would long be the foe of the Byzantine Empire. The Persians were always trying to gain land and territory, and eventually did conquer Asia Minor. And we haven't even talked about the rise of Islam yet. The great Emperor Justinian I built the Eastern Roman Empire back up, conquering a significant part of Italy and North Africa. However, these were not secure. He lost some of these lands even by the end of his reign. Never again would the Eastern Empire control any significant lands in the West. Nevertheless, Justinian achieved a rebirth of civilization. He established a strong tradition of law. He also oversaw the building of the greatest cathedral before Gothic architecture in the Hagia Sophia, which you can see pictured here. Modern architects still don't know how Justinian's workmen were able to place the dome on the top of that church. Like the Byzantine Empire, it stood proudly as a monument to the strength of Greek Christianity. While Greek Christians didn't use the rise or the rule of Benedict, as we saw in circa 570 or 560 when Benedict wrote his rule and Western monasticism took off, there was still a strong tradition of monasticism in the East. They had more hermits, eremitic monks that would go off by themselves than the West did, and also they had a strong presence in major cities throughout the Eastern Roman Empire. Then things got even worse after the reign of Justinian and the contraction of the empire. From the south and the east, new dangers reared their heads. The most significant, of course, was the rise of Islam. By the mid-8th century, the blossoming Islamic empire, started by Muhammad, which was symbolized, of course, by when he conquered Mecca, and continued by his followers, had completely conquered the Levant and North Africa, as you can see on this map. Even Asia Minor, a part of the Roman Empire for centuries, fell. Various Islamic empires would threaten Asia Minor and eventually Constantinople until its fall 7 centuries later. Of course, Muslims got to the walls of Constantinople several times, but it's the fact that the city was built with such strong defenses enabled it to withstand the pressures of the incursions by various Islamic empires. You see, it was built right on we're surrounded by water on 3 sides, and the other side had strong three deep walls that were able to keep it safe, and because it was right on the water, they could trade and still get food whenever they were besieged. So it was a very, very strong city, and that served it well because they lost many of the lands surrounding the city. As we've seen, the Crusades were intended to help the Eastern Roman Empire, but instead they only hurt it. At first, in the first through third Crusades, there was some collaboration, some teamwork between the Western Latin Empire and the East, although the Westerners didn't return the lands that they took to the East as they had initially said after the First Crusade and established their own Crusader states. That began to sour relations, but of course nothing was worse than the disaster of 1204 and the Fourth Crusade, in which the Crusaders actually conquered Constantinople, took it for themselves, and created the Latin Empire of Constantinople. And this map shows you what it looked like in 1215 with all the different empires surrounding that Latin Empire of Constantinople. that stood for over 60 years and was a galling reminder of how the West had betrayed its Eastern brothers. I guess the only thing I want to say then is that the most remarkable thing of Constantinople is that it stayed alive, that it retained its strength for 200 years after this great disaster of the West taking it. By the 15th century, now that we're in the development of the fall of Constantinople, the Ottoman Turks were the Islamic empire that posed the greatest threat to Constantinople. They had amassed significant weapons. You can see one here in this massive cannon that they built that was meant to pierce the walls of Constantinople using gunpowder, which was a relatively new technology at the time. The Ottoman Turks lusted for the economic benefit of controlling the port city of Constantinople. Because Constantinople stood at the boundary between the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea, it controlled much of the trade that went through there, including the goods that would come from the Far East through the Silk Road, the same Silk Road that Marco Polo had explored a couple centuries earlier. The Ottoman Turks longed for the glory of being the ones that would finally bring this city to its knees, this eternal Rome, this eternal Eastern Rome of Constantinople. They wanted to show the Christian world that the Muslims were superior. Mehmet II, who's pictured at the head of this army, on the right side here, achieved this victory with his wall-piercing cannons and his massive army. This story illustrates the deadly cost of the breakdown of Christendom. In the winter of 1452, as Mehmet II was gathering his forces, Constantinople prepared for assault by rebuilding its walls and gathering provisions. There was a Hungarian cannon maker named Urban who offered his services to the Emperor Constantine XI. Unfortunately, Constantine didn't have the funds to pay him. So what did the Hungarian cannon maker do, the Christian? He went over to Mehmet, who immediately hired him. It turns out that this cannon maker had plans to construct the largest cannon ever made. It was 1,800 pounds and hurled stones that were 7 feet around. Urban's cannon turned out to do the trick as far as destroying the massive triple walls of the once impenetrable city. As Susan Weisbauer writes, quote, "By the morning of the 29th, Constantinople belonged to the Turks in 1453. The last fragile link with the Roman Empire was broken, and Christendom had fallen with the city. No longer was there a great universal empire that has stretched over many different Christian nations. Now we only had Christian nations individually, not united in the same way. And that is what the fall of Constantinople symbolizes." The not so subtle image in the upper right hand corner of a broken down church is sort of the image that I want to leave you with about the fall of Constantinople and the state of Europe and the East in the Middle Ages. Really, the fall of Constantinople, we're talking about the results now, of course. The fall of Constantinople brought to an end the Middle Ages. Many scholars claim that. And there's two reasons mostly. First, it ended the ideal of Christendom. So even though the Western and Eastern churches had split in 1054 officially, they sought reconciliation again and again. They both knew that they needed one another, since Christ had prayed, as recorded in the Gospel of John, that his followers would be one as he and the Father were one, unified. They also needed to withstand the hostility of various Muslim armies that kept rising up from the sands of Arabia and the plains of Persia. But they never achieved their goals because of pride and greed. Neither side made the compromises necessary to achieve union. Both sides looked out for their own interests when push came to shove. The enmity from that rift continues to the present day. Perhaps the inability of the West to heal that fracture in the church contributed to the splintering that happened in the 16th century with the Reformation. You'll study that next year. The second reason that the fall of Constantinople ended the Middle Ages is that it forced Greek Christian culture to migrate west, which met up with forces that were already seeking to undermine the institution of the Roman Catholic Church as it had existed throughout the Middle Ages and the scholastic thought of the universities. The Byzantine scholars that ended up in Venice and Florence and Paris and Rome brought with them manuscripts of Greek texts of the Bible. They brought Greek manuscripts of Aristotle, Ptolemy, Galen, and others that had long been forgotten or only partially known, at least in the West. So this connected busy Western thinkers with intellectual traditions that fruitfully contributed to their own. So a great example, maybe the most famous example of this, was with Erasmus of Rotterdam, and he's pictured there on the bottom right of your screen, the great scholar. Erasmus was able to compile a Greek edition of the New Testament that subverted some commonly held beliefs. As an example, he showed that the Greek word underlying the term penance, metanoia, or epistrepho, should actually be translated repentance. And that led to the theology that sins don't require extra work to be done so that atonement could be made. They only needed the sinner's willingness to receive God's gracious forgiveness through Jesus Christ's person and work. So this could be seen as a positive, though disruptive, benefit to the fall of Constantinople. So the two results were we end up with a fractured church, but we also end up with a West that was revivified with ideas that came from the Greek. All right, at this point, as we conclude this lecture, I also want to go back and review some things that we've looked at in this class so far. You can think about the Middle Ages as broken up into three groups of people, right? Those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. If you'll recall, we looked at this in the very first lecture that I gave this year, and as we looked over medieval history. Right, so those who pray, this involves the clergy and monastics, whether monks or nuns. We saw that those who pray were the ones who really held society together after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. They're the ones who preserved culture. They're the ones who found a haven in the midst of chaos. And the Rule of Benedict was composed in 560 in the midst of all this turmoil because it was a way of ordering life and seeing life as having a goal and an ideal that was greater than what could be perceived with mere sight. We see that those who pray helped forge empires. Alcuin helped Charlemagne establish his empire that could bring multiple kinds of people together, Saxons and Gauls, or Franks in this case, that they could actually come together and form one empire underneath the banner of the church. And we saw that those who pray also could lead crusades, as Bernard of Clairvaux and Peter the Hermit demonstrated in their preaching for the First Crusade that Pope Urban himself called in 1095. We see those who pray. Also not doing the best job with that, using the power of the church in order to accomplish political ends, and that became even more and more prominent later, skipping ahead to the 13th and 14th centuries when we see the Avignon papacy start and the Great Schism of popes, when those who pray were corrupt and they didn't do what they were supposed to do. They didn't have the answers when the Black Death hit. They often fell short of their own ideals, and because of that created much cynicism amongst Christians at that time. We also see, though, that those who pray could do amazing things, amazing works of integrity and love, like what St. Francis was able to do with his ideal of poverty, his utter integrity, that was able to care for the poor and to give people hope where there was no hope. Millions flocked to that way of life, or the Dominican way of life, led by St. Dominic, and then followed up with Thomas Aquinas and others. We see that those who pray to advanced education, they definitely struggle to stay faithful there too, as you could see by the condemnations of 1277 and the ways that reason would often cause people to question their faith when divorced from a robust faith that also encompassed reason, that followed the ideals of Augustine and Anselm of faith-seeking understanding. That didn't always happen. Sometimes people wanted to put reason first, and faith always suffers when that happens. We see that there were those who fight in the Middle Ages: the knights, the kings, the barons, the aristocracy. Those who fight were the ones who brought down the Roman Empire in the first place. The Goths who overran and broke up the organization that the Roman Empire had preserved for a long time. We see, though, that those who fight could also mend things. We saw that those who fight prevented the forces of Islam from taking over Europe. We see that those who fight, like with Charles Martel, for instance, and then we see his grandson Charlemagne fight to forge a kingdom that began to establish this ideal of Christendom, the union of church and kingdom. We saw that those who fight went to the Holy Land and were able to win back Jerusalem for a period of time. But we see that those who fight were also had a hard time staying on the right track, doing the right thing. And part of it was the fault of those who pray for not guiding those who fight properly. We see those who fight begin to forge some rights, and with the Magna Carta, pushing back on a king who wanted to tax them too heavily. We see those who fight ending up capitulating to nationalism and national ideals and forsaking the ideal of Christendom, and that was exemplified, for instance, in the 100 Years' War, where knights wanted to fight for their king, to have his lands whenever he had a claim to it, however slim that claim might be, however costly it might be to the peasants underneath them. We see that those who fight were ultimately unable to keep the land together here with the fall of Constantinople. And then there's those who work. There's not as much to say about them because they simply didn't say as much. Not that they didn't have things to say, but they weren't the ones who were reading and writing. Those who work, the serfs, the peasants, the artisans, they're the unheralded heroes of the Middle Ages in a lot of ways, but they had their flaws as well. We see that those who work were able to develop technologies to continue farming better. We saw that those who work died in droves in the Black Death. We see that those who work were able to achieve some magnificent accomplishments. Think back to our lecture on architecture, medieval architecture. Those who work were the stonemasons and the builders who were able to create such massive edifices as the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris or the Chartres Cathedral. These amazing buildings that stand even today as monuments of the glory and beauty of Christianity. Those who work would become very, very important in the modern era, starting with the Reformation, when they were the ones who were starting to be able to read. That's something you can look forward to as you go into 11th grade history. These categories start to blend together a bit more when we get further in time. I hope that you've seen how the Middle Ages started, developed, and ended in this course. I hope that your medieval history knowledge and your Bible knowledge will help you make sound decisions as you go forward in your lives. And I hope that you'd be blessed and edified, that you would think about the purposes that God has not only for you as an individual, but for society as a whole, and how we as Christians can bring that about in ways that avoid the errors of the Middle Ages, but maybe build on some of its successes. Many blessings to you all. That's all.